And this week, what we will do is basically we are introducing you two really core, important concepts in programming in general and in Python. We show how to do it in Python. So loops is the other one. So how to iterate over lists, or how to do kind of many times certain processes. So that's really kind of where we are really approaching to the such things where programming comes really handy. So that's a good thing and approach to learn. And the other one is conditional statements. So when you have a process flow in your code, so how do you choose if certain value is, for example, if the temperature is below 15 degrees, it's mild. If it's above 25 degrees, it's actually getting hot, at least in Finland. So those kind of cases, so they are really kind of powerful concepts in programming. So we will learn about that. So basically the learning goals for this week is that you will understand what is a for loop, and then you understand the difference and how to use if statements, elif statements and else statements. And that's about it. We will again upload the lecture videos in here. This is the lecture from last year that you can already take a look if you're interested. But let's start with the for loops. Again, if you want to follow, you can launch the student binder version of this one and basically follow up what I'm doing. To save some time, I actually have this open here already, so I launched the binder for me. Is there someone who really wants to follow? Because I can just wait a little bit so that you can actually get the binder open before we continue. Yeah, so let's wait a couple of minutes so that you can get the binder open and so on. Okay, so maybe I continue. So now we're discussing about for loops and loops in general. How many of you are familiar with the concept of loop in programming? Nice, this is nice. Good. For those of you who haven't heard about loops, it's basically a concept and approach in programming that you want to repeat certain tasks a number of times. And how many times you conduct or do certain processes, you can basically control that by in different ways. So, like from the real life example of loop is basically our everyday lives. We are kind of doing certain tasks every morning. For example, we wake up, then I do some coffee, then I drink it, and then I go to work, and this repeats basically every day. So these kind of iterations are really common in programming as well, and especially when coming to automating processes, which is basically one of the core things that we are learning here. So that is basically really the kind of core of loops. So if you have let's say 1,000 files and you want to search something, like some keywords from those files, so loops are basically the technique to go in programming. So you basically iterate over those 1,000 files and, for example, open the file and search for something in there. So instead of manually clicking and do it, it can take like hours and hours of time. But with programming, you can actually do it fairly quickly and simply. So, but let's start looking at what is a for loop and how we actually can use it. So I have let's see if I can get it a bit bigger. Yes, can you see it in the back row? Yeah, if you can't, come closer. That's the easy way to do it. Let's start by defining a variable. So these are kind of things that you have already done quite a bit. So let's define a variable called word, and let's make it as a string. So let's say that our variable word is snow. And now we can take a look, for example, what do we have in there. So indeed, it contains snow in here. So this is something that you have done already many times. So now let's make an example that I would like to basically print out each letter of that word snow. So what you have learned this far is that you have learned how to play with indices. So you had those lists and basically you were able to take one item from that list. In a similar manner, we can also take items from this kind of string sentence or word in here. So if we basically say, for example, that print word 0, what we will get out from that word is the first character of that string. In a similar manner, if we would basically want to go through each one of these letters in here for, I don't know, whatever purpose, we can basically just do it like this. So this would be the second one, then we would have the third one at index 2, and remember again, as we mentioned last week, so the first value in Python is always 0, and that's a good thing to remember. And the last one is index number 3. So as you can see, now we were able to kind of print out all the letters from that word snow. But of course, if you would have a novel and for some reason, and there is 100,000 letters in that novel, and you would for some reason want to do this same thing, I don't know for whatever purpose, so this is probably not a good approach. So how can we actually do that? Before going there, let's take another sample. Let's say that word eyes. So this is again another word, and then we have, let's do the same thing. So following the approach that we used here, let's print out the letters. So we can say that word 0 equals to 1, yes, and we have, oh, there's an extra print statement here, yes. And the second one is word 1, and it's C. And then the third one is E. And then thinking that you would basically automate this in a way that you would use this approach that you always print out like 4 letters from the word. So of course, if we do it in here, what will happen? Any ideas? Sorry?
Out of range?
Yes. So basically what we will have is that it complains that Python cannot find the 4th letter in this word attribute. And basically it throws an index error that I cannot find, or the string index out of range, so we cannot find anything. So that's kind of problems that you might face if you're kind of doing and printing out words in this manner, which is possible but not really recommended way. So now let's see how we can use loops to actually sort out this kind of issue. So let's again specify that our word is that snow. So how we iterate over each letter of this word is that we can indeed use for loop. And in Python, defining for loop is fairly simple. We have this keyword that we always start, which is, surprise, surprise, for. And then we have a variable, let's say character in word. So this is basically how you define a for loop in Python. And then there's another, let's print out first and see what happens, and then I will explain a bit what do we have here. So this is basically how we iterate over each character in this word. So it's fairly intuitive from the syntax side. And then what we are doing is that we are printing that character from that from the word. So when we execute this, we will get snow. So it's basically printing out each character of the word. So there are a few important things when defining a loop, a for loop in Python. First of all, there is this for keyword. Then there is this collection, whether it is a collection of letters, such as here, or characters, which is a string basically, or then this collection can be a list, for example. So there is some object that you are looping over, like you want to iterate over this collection, and then this character car that we specify here, this is basically a variable that you are defining. So this word can basically be anything you want, but typically you want it to be something really intuitive. So in this case, like a character would be like a good variable name, and I can actually change it to this one. And when I print out that character, it will work in a similar manner. Well, you might see in the examples of when looping or looking at the internet quite many times something like for x in blah blah blah, print x. Don't do this. I don't even know why I showed this to you, but that doesn't, it's not intuitive at all. So you're kind of, well, I have this x here, but what does it do? So really the key thing is to use that kind of variable name that are intuitive to understand. So we have variable, then we have the collection of what we are iterating over, we have the for key loop, and this in is basically just to say that in this collection that we are using, and then we are doing something for that character. What is also important in Python is this colon. So this is kind of a Python way of specifying that after this kind of statement here, this for loop statement, do something with this character. And one thing what is also really specific to Python programming language is the kind of indentation. So whenever you see something like this, so colon, you need to indent the stuff that happens before, happens after. So indent the tasks that are done inside the loop. So basically whatever you have intended like this, so there is actually four spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is really typical in Python, or the other way of doing it is just pressing tabulator. So that is how you do an indentation in Python. So whatever is inside this indentation, that will be repeated over each, well, in this case, each letter in here. So we can say that, well, print character, and let's say print character plus woohoo. And when we do this, you see that now we have basically two kind of processes that we were doing. First, we print the character, and the second one, we print the character, and then we make this addition into that one, which is woohoo, and it will be repeated. So this is kind of the basic workflow in Python when doing loops. And here we have on the course side basically an explanation of exactly this same thing. Maybe I do it like this. So indeed we have variable in some collection, do things with that variable. So that is the approach that we use all the time in Python. So as I mentioned about the live, so this would be kind of the everyday life version of that loop. So for day in my life, I wake up, then I take a shower, then I eat breakfast, and then I brush teeth, and then I go to work and do so and so on. So this is kind of how in Python programming language you would define these kind of things. So if you could control yourself programmably, this could be an approach how you could do it. So let's take another example, which is also can be quite useful. So let's make this a bit smaller again. So one really useful thing to know is basically that when you're iterating over some collection, for example the letters in Word, so it's quite often useful to know how many times you have already done those iterations. So the first time you execute something, that was the first time, and then the second one is the second time, and third one is the third time. You get the point. So that is a useful thing to know, and let's see how we can actually do that. So we can specify a variable for length. This is, by the way, how we in Python write comments, and writing comments is really important so that you understand what you do. So length equals to 0, and let's make a loop again. So let's iterate over another word. So let's say that for letter in lizard, and then the idea is that we have this kind of longish word, and we want to find out how many letters there are in this word. So how can we find out that thing? So letter in blizzard. So how can we do that is that we have defined the variable length, which equals to 0. So then we can basically say that we update this length variable, well, not update, we kind of recreate it, and say that length equals to any guesses what we could do in here? How could we update the length variable in a way that we can actually see how many letters there are in this word?
Length plus 1.
Yes, that's correct. So if we want to update that variable, we can say that length, so we redefine the variable length equals to length, which is in the first round 0, and then we just say that plus 1. So this will basically kind of all the time update the variable, and in the end we will know how many variables did we have. So let's run this. Nothing happens in here, but the length variable has been updated. So we can basically print out that there are, and then the length. So how many letters do we have? And this is the way to do it. So we can basically see that there are 8 letters in this word blizzard, and this can be useful. I don't know how often do I need to know how many characters there are in a word, but sometimes you might. And then of course when iterating over some lists where you have items inside and you're interacting with them, then this might be really useful. But now what is good is that we have this word blizzard. We can basically say that this can be whatever. So we can say, for example, that for letter in thunderstorm. And just executing this one time again, and now we can basically see that, okay, in this word there seems to be 12 letters in the one. And this is kind of again, you can probably see the kind of benefit is that these words that you specify here can be whatever you want. It can be that novel. So you have a file with I don't know how many letters or characters, and you indeed want to know how many there are. So this is kind of one approach that you could use. So you can basically just count each character in there. At this point, does this feel somehow intuitive? No. How many are totally not getting it? Or at least a bit not getting it? Yes, a few. So let's maybe repeat this one more time. So this might be a good place. So basically for loop is that you have some kind of collection that you are iterating over. It can be a word with letters, it can be a list with values, and then what you want to do is that for each of those values in the list you want to do some process. So that's kind of a really common thing to do, and in Python you basically can iterate and conduct many times some processes for those values. Is that you define a for loop which is done like this, and then for each of those values in a list, for example, you can do something, and those what you are actually doing for those values is basically done below this column here, and when you have indented these things that you do. So that is kind of the basic approach. You will do this many and many times, and basically just by practicing you will find out and learn how to do it. So don't worry that much if you don't get it perfectly at this time. So when I said that about the indentation, so this is basically indented. How do you actually write that? Well, let's see it like this. Things will be executed on each loop. So when you are iterating over, that's basically a one loop. And this will be done on each case, but when we basically go back to the beginning of the cell, this one will be only executed once. So let's say print length. So something good to understand is that only this part that was intended was executed on each loop, so on each letter that you iterate over from this one. And then when you kind of are ready, you take the code back to the beginning of the line, and this is basically this is the code block that you iterate over. When it's done, go to the next command, and this is not intended so it will be done only once. So this is also really core principle in programming. So when you're executing and when you're writing your code, how the computer understands and executes is basically line by line. So first, the computer, how it sees this is basically that it reads that, okay, there's this kind of comment, don't do anything. Then on the second line, okay, this guy wants to make this kind of length variable, let's do this and specify a value for that one. Then there seems to be this kind of loop, so it executes this one here, and basically executes as many times as defined in this loop, and then it goes to the next line and prints out the length. So this is kind of a step-by-step thing, which is kind of a core thing in programming. Good. Let's continue with the new thing that might be useful. So there is a way in Python to specify that how many times do you want to do something. So let's see that I want to do print value like 5 times. So we can again start by specify a for loop. So again we start by saying for value. So now we are kind of doing something with some value in range 5. And let's say that print out that value. And I execute this so that you can see what happens. So what do we have in here? Is again, it's a similar kind of loop that what we did before, but now we have this specific function called range, and we have this number inside there called 5. So this range function can be really useful in terms of specifying that, okay, I don't care what I'm doing, but I want to do it 5 times. So this is exactly there, the technique how to do it. So we say that for value in range 5, and this range can be whatever number. It can be 5, it can be 10, and when we do that, we will have 10 numbers in here. So this is really useful. So range function is something that you will use a lot already in the exercises this week, and it will basically give the number. So what do we have in here? The value, it's just a number, integer number, starting from, in this case, from 0, and when we have 10 values that we want to iterate over, so the last value is 9. And this is exactly what we are seeing here. How this function range works. So indeed, this is what we were using here. So these are kind of tools. Functions are kind of tools that you can use in programming to do certain tasks, and this is just a tool that basically creates numbers starting from some or with some range. How you can get help how certain function in Python works is, well, you specify help, and then inside this you specify the function that you're interested in. So let's see when we say help range. So here we can actually see how this tool or function works. So there are different ways of using this. First thing is that you specify range and then you specify the value, the index value, when to stop. So when you have iterated, let's say 10 times, stop there. So that's kind of what we saw just before. And then we can see that there is also another way of saying this. We can say that for range, start, stop, and then optionally you can also say step. So that is kind of, so you can specify multiple values inside this range and basically do it that way. I think we will see examples of that one. Yeah, so we have a poll question here. So if you go to the Geo-Python geopython.github.io and /poll. So here we have a question for you. So which values in the range function would produce the desired screen output? So and we have it here. Oh, not there. So using the documentation that we saw, what would produce these kind of numbers in here? So we have 2, 5, and 8. And in the poll, we basically have the options that you can choose. So taking a look at this documentation here. So we have this range function that again can produce some values, and then we have two possibilities how this can be used, this range function. So we have range stop, then we have range start, stop, and step. So what values should you put inside this range function to produce these numbers? And let's see, you can take a look at the here you have the options. So which one from these would produce numbers 2, 5, and 8? Let's take a moment to think about it. Then we can also take a look how you think about it. Good. We have basically two winners here. We have either 2, 8, or 3, or 2, 9, and 3. Those are both good questions, and let's see which one. It seems that 2, 8, and 3 seems to be winning at this point, but the other one is pretty okay as well. So we wanted to produce numbers 2, 5, and 8 to the screen with this range function. We have that many people. Yeah, many okay, I guess we start to see that 2, 8 and 3 seems to be the winning solution in here, and then 2, 9 and 3 is the other one. Well, let's find out which one of these seem to be correct. So let's start with the winner one, 2, 8 and 3. So let's set up, make a new cell in here. So poll test. So the winner was again 2, 8, 3. So we can create a function for value, or not function but loop, for value in range. And again, so let's specify number 2. This is basically where we start iterating, and this is correct. That was the same in both answers that you gave us. And the next value was 8, and the third one is 3. So now when looking at the documentation, we have defined that start from value 2, correct, stop at value 8, and then have a step of 3. So on each iteration, step over a few values and basically iterate and produce that kind of thing. So we can test out for value in range, print value. This is what happens. So we have numbers 2 and 5, but we are missing the 8. And what is the reason here? The lucky 7 people who guessed this correct probably have done programming before. Don't know, or then they have good logic and can understand and read the documentation. But the right answer is 9. And why is that? So that's kind of the logic of how this range function works, is that it prints out, start from 2, it stops at 9. So it goes basically, it looks for these values that, okay, I need to step over 3 times, and it looks that, okay, I started from 2, then I kind of skip a few numbers, then the second one is 5, okay, and it's less than this number 9 in here. I print that. Then it goes to the next loop where the value is 5, then it adds basically 3, so the step there. Then it checks that, okay, should I stop in here? The number is 8 at that point. No, I'm basically, this is not the point where I go. And then the last time is basically that it will print out the number 8. So exactly the stop is the kind of, this can be a bit confusing, at least it was for me when I first started using these. So indeed, it's not that print out the last value, it's kind of the place where it will stop and it will not execute that. So that's kind of the key thing in here. So start, stop and step. So this would produce the correct answer, and I would assume that actually this one as well would produce the same answer, yes. Because what it looks is that it basically looks at the values and says that is it basically below something, these values in here. This is the next step that we would get. So if we have 12 in here, then we would have basically the fourth iteration where this will actually execute something. But again, this is the correct. So something to understand about loops and the range range function especially. This can be really useful, kind of understanding how this range function can be used, so that you can actually skip over certain values. We have exercises where you actually want to do that, and there might be even some rational reason why you want to do that, so you will see that. Okay, let's continue. So as I mentioned already many times, typically when you are looping, you're doing it because you have some kind of collection such as list. So this is by far the most common place where you use loops. So let's start working with list. So here we have values inside this my list. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they are basically floating point numbers, so decimal numbers that we have. So let's create that one, and we can print out what kind of values do we have there. So indeed it seems that we have these 6 values in our list. So now what we want to do is that we basically want to iterate over each values in that list, and then we want to kind of add from the first the value that we are iterating over. So for this value, what we want to do is that we want to sum these two together. So let's see what I mean, and it's maybe so for index in range 6, typically, so what we are now iterating over are these values based on the indices of that list. So as you remember, this range function creates numbers starting from 0 up to the value mentioned in here. So this is kind of how we can actually get the values from that list. So for index in range 6, and then how can we actually fetch those values from a list? You saw that last week with Bill, and in the exercise when practicing the list things. So you basically specify the collection, so my list, and then you inside these square brackets you specify the index value that you are iterating. So let's see what happens in here. So indeed what we have is that we have exactly those values that we have in here. So we printed over each item on that list. And again, thinking a bit like broadly, this is not just printing out those values, but you can do whatever you want with those values. So you can basically create your own program that can do lots of things. Now what we want to do is that we basically want to modify these values. So we want to basically indeed iterate over each value in here. Then we want to add on the last what we want to do is that we want to add the value plus the index value what we are iterating over. So again, starting from the similar thing, so we can say that my list, so again we want to do something in here, then we want to say that my list at index number, which is coming from this range. What we want to do is that we want to update that value in this position here with the value that is in there. So in this case it will be 0, and then we want to sum the index plus that value. again, don't know really why, but just that you can see that we can actually update some things. So when I execute this, we will basically convert these values to something else. And let's see what happens. So what you see in here is exactly what we have written in here. So now we updated, this was the original list that we had. So we had a list with values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we updated that list with, and now we have values 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So let's go this bit slowly, and I try to explain so that you understand what is happening in here. What was the meaning of the loop? So what we wanted to do in here, well, I don't know, is there really a good purpose for doing this, but important approaches and things that you want to understand from this is that you are iterating over some number of times, and then you have some collection of values, and the important thing is that you have the value at location 0, for example, and you can update that, and that's kind of one of the key things. So at my list at index I equals to, and then you can specify a new value into that one. And what is the value that we are actually assigning to that position of the list is the original value that you had plus the index value, which is, it starts from 0, then the next one is 1, the next after that is 2, and so on. So that is exactly what we are seeing in here. So kind of the approach that I want you to understand or seeing from here is that there's the range function, there's the possibility to update the value inside that original list. And why do we get these values? Well, let's think this over. So what happens when I go over that list for the first time? So the first loop using this range function, the value inside this I variable is 0, because range starts from 0 and iterates over the amount of times based on this number, and without specifying any step, it will basically just like add one number on a time on each loop. So what will happen is that we have in the first loop value 0 here, then we say that we have this list of values, so we take the value whatever is inside this list at position 0, and what that value is, well, it's number 0. Then what we will do is that we will update or kind of reassign a value to that position. And what is the value that we are updating there? Well, it's the original value that was there, so 0 plus the value I, which in the first loop was 0. So basically, what is 0 plus 0? It's, well, 0. And okay, that's what we see here. Then this starts to change when we go to the next loop. So the first one loop was, the I value was 0. On the next one, it is 1. So let's kind of iterate and think this through another time. So my list at position 1, the value, well, is 1. Then we are updating that. So take the original value 1 and add the index value, which is in this case 1. So 1 plus 1 well, equals to 2. And we do this over and over again. So on the next loop, the original value is 2, then the list value, the updated value will be 2 plus 2, it's 4, and you can see it, how this kind of works. So at the end, the my list will have these kind of values, and that's how this works. What if we do this another time? So now our values inside that list is 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. This will of course change because the original values in the list weren't the same one is in here. So now the original value of the first index, it was 0, but on the second one it was 1 plus 1, which is 2. And then basically we had the original value as 2, and then we made a sum of the index, so 2 plus 1 equals to 3. Then on the second one we had 4, then 4 plus 2 equals to 6, and so on. Might seem a bit confusing, but don't worry. The important thing in here is that you can loop over, you can take the values from a list, you can update that value, and those are the kind of take-home messages of this part. Whatever happens inside here, like why are we updating it like this, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, we have a question.
So for the variable, it doesn't matter what I put there?
Yes, good question. Yeah, so there was a question about there is this I in here, does it matter what that kind of variable in here is? No, it doesn't matter. We can change that to maybe more intuitive, for index in range. So now instead of I is really common way to shorten the word index, but this might be actually a bit more intuitive one. So we can say that for index in range 6, then my list and the value that we are taking, my list take the value from index 0, update it with the update the index value like this. So this is doing exactly the same. I just do it like this. So we will have exactly the same result. So this is kind of a good thing to understand. So the variable that you specify here, you can create it, you can name it any way you want, basically. But whenever looping over, you need to remember that you need to use that variable inside the loop to actually get the values, because this variable contains the index information on each loop. That was a good question. Good. Let's do one final thing. Then we have one poll, and then basically we can have a break. So there is not kind of much more to learn in terms of loops. So if you're more or less kind of following what is happening, that's good, because this is basically it, what you want to practice and know. But one good thing in terms of loops is to understand how many items there are in some collection, such as list. So you have seen this, I think you have seen this length function, which basically specifies like how many items there are, for example, in that my list that I defined earlier. So this len function just shows that, okay, in that list there is 6 values in there. And this can be quite useful because in here what we did was that we manually defined that, okay, that number is 6. But what if you have a list with 8 numbers? Then basically with this approach you would manually need to update the value to 8. But of course that is not what you want to do, because you want to automate stuff. You want to know that, okay, it doesn't matter how many values there are, iterate that number of times, that list. So how we can do that is by taking advantage of that length function. So let's kind of do similar thing as before. I first do this one more time so that they are in place. So let's repeat what we did, but let's do a minor change in here. So instead of specifying number 6, we say that take whatever is the length of that list. So in for I in range, length my list. So now you can have whatever kind of list and how many values there ever would be, and this will always know that it will iterate over that number of times over that list. And then we can again do similar thing. So we update the original value. My list I equals to my list I plus 1. And then we print out those values. Not like this. Oops. Oh, there is a typo in here. Hey. Yeah. This is what happens also to programmers who have done this many times. So you make syntax errors, and that's kind of reality. So now what we see here is that we indeed kind of updated those values in the original list, and we can run it another time and we will see different values and so on. So why this approach is useful is exactly what I mentioned, that if the list length changes, so the kind of what you do shouldn't change. So you should be able to do the same things as in here. So you should be able to update those values no matter how many values you have inside that list. So let's see how we can do that. From the exercise 2, you already saw that you can add new values to a list. So we can say that I have this my list and I want to add, so append a new value 18, or let's say 15. And what we have now, so now we have those values, and then the last value here is 15. Let's add there another value, my list append, and let's say it's 18. And again, let's print out my list. And now we can see that, okay, instead of those 6 values, now we seem to have 8 values in here. So thinking of the difference between these two approaches, specifying the value, like hard coding the number 6, would in this case only update up to this value 12, and then it would stop. But when we use this len function, it actually kind of takes care of the fact that it will do and repeat the same thing for each value that you have on that list. So for index in range, the length of that my list do something. And what do we want to do is that we want to update those values inside that list. So at index update and say that my list at that index value is the original value plus the index. And this works, and let's see this one there, and let's see what do we have in here. So now we can see that each of these values have been updating. So 0 equals to 0, but 5 is different than 6 and so on.
Can you show the code that was before this?
Yes. So this one. Does this seem logical? Are you following? Who is more or less kind of in there? Getting it? Yeah. You will practice this a lot. These loops, the experience from earlier years, so it takes some time to actually kind of get it, but with certain amount of practice, you will kind of learn to master the loops. So it might seem a bit tricky at the beginning, but don't worry, it's kind of at some point typically the light bulbs brightens, and then you kind of know how they work. The last question, so we have another poll. So when you go to the poll again, so there is a question like this. So we have word ice pellets, and then we say that for I in range length word, and then we print word at index. So what output would this program produce? These basically the answers, the possible answers in here, so each value in here would be on their own line, so it doesn't actually look exactly as it would on the screen. But basically, what would be the values printed out in this one? So let's the screen, and here we have the poll. Let's see, there's so many different options. So we have values from 0 to 10. We have ice pellets, like with the separate one. We have 10. We have S. We have ice and syntax error. Then we have indentation error. So there are a bit different opinions in here. Most of you seem to be in favor of the ice pellets, but then there are quite many of you who are kind of thinking that, okay, it is bringing the index of the thing. Both are good answers, but it seems to be, we seem to have a winner in here. We have around 30 answers, so let's move. So the winner seems to be ice pellets in this way. So let's see. That might be the correct answer, but we can always test that out. So word is ice pellets for I in range length word print word I, and ta-da! Indeed, the winner was the winner, so it was the correct answer. So basically what we did here was that we iterated over whatever is the length of this word. So the len works also with strings, so it will kind of give you the information about how many characters there are in certain string. And then we are printing over each letter of that string, and it will produce ice pellets in this way. And that was basically what you answered. So that's good. So this is all about for loops. Maybe a good thing to understand is that there is also a different loop called while, but this is by far the most common one, at least that I use. So, but when you look over the internet, you might see that, okay, there is this kind of while loop as well, but let's learn this for loop first, and then if there is need, we can also learn the other one. But that's it for this at this point.